The sky over the Pir Panjal range was unusually quiet on the morning of May 7, 2025. Frost still clung to the pines as the sun tried to burn through the lingering haze of dawn. But silence was not a promise of peace. In the bunkers carved into the hillside near Kupwara, Indian soldiers were already on high alert. Messages had been coming in all night. Drones had picked up abnormal movement across the line of control. There had been shelling in small bursts over the last 48 hours, but something was different this time. Captain Aryan Rathore checked his watch. 0500 hours. He had been awake for over 22 hours straight, coordinating logistics, reading intel, and preparing his men. Tensions had been climbing ever since the attack in Pahalgam 2 weeks earlier. 27 civilians dead, most of them pilgrims, and an underground group known as the Resistance Front had claimed responsibility. Delhi had pointed its finger firmly at Rawalpindi, alleging the group was a proxy of Lashkar-e-Taiba and backed by the Pakistani ISI. Islamabad denied everything. As always, when India launched Operation Sindoor just before dawn, the world held its breath. Cruise missiles screamed across the airspace, targeting 9 critical locations deep within Pakistan-administered Kashmir and into parts of Punjab province. These were not speculative hits. Indian intelligence had tracked the safehouses, communications centers, and weapons caches used by the militant group. The strike was surgical but ruthless. In Islamabad, the news broke shortly after sunrise. Air raid sirens blared in several cities for the first time since 1999. Civilian casualties were reported. A school in Muzaffarabad had taken shrapnel. The death toll was unclear. But what was certain was that retaliation was now inevitable. Pakistan's air defense systems scrambled within minutes. At PAF base Murad, pilots suited up as orders were barked down the chain of command. Mirage 3 fighters were airborne by 0600 hours. Not long after, skirmishes began over the Rajouri sector. 2 Indian Suhois intercepted the Pakistani jets. The first dogfight of the war lasted under 4 minutes. Both sides lost a bird. 1 Indian pilot ejected behind enemy lines. Within hours, his face was being broadcast on Pakistani news channels. A familiar pattern, but this time the escalation was not symbolic. In the war rooms of South Block, New Delhi, Prime Minister Anya Verma stood with her military advisors, watching live satellite feeds. She had authorized the strikes after intelligence confirmed the Pahalgam attackers had trained in Balakot and received direct logistical support from handlers operating out of Lahore. Diplomacy had failed. UN envoys had called for restraint. Washington and London issued joint statements urging both nuclear-armed neighbors to step back from the brink. But the decision had already been made. Across the border in Islamabad, Prime Minister Farooq Jalal held a press conference with the flag of Pakistan behind him, vowing that every drop of blood spilled would be avenged. That evening, Pakistan launched Operation Ghazwa, retaliating with long-range artillery and tactical drone strikes on Indian military installations in Baramulla and Uri. Power went out across many parts of North Kashmir as transmission lines were hit. Civilians fled in droves toward Srinagar. Trains were cancelled. Mobile networks began to falter. The state of Jammu and Kashmir was now fully militarized. Back in Kupwara, Captain Rathore's unit came under heavy mortar fire. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Jain, took a piece of shrapnel to the leg and had to be airlifted. Rathore ordered his unit to push forward under the cover of darkness to take higher ground. It was a bloodied slope. They lost 2 men. One of them, a 19-year-old recruit from Haryana named Surjit, had never seen combat before. He died clutching a photo of his mother. Rathore didn't have time to mourn. Reinforcements were already inbound. Meanwhile, in Lahore, hospitals filled with the wounded. Airstrikes had struck near a police training academy where several civilians had been caught in the blast radius. News outlets clashed over the numbers. India claimed it was a weapons depot being camouflaged as a civilian facility. Pakistan broadcast images of bloodied children being carried out of the rubble. The world watched in horror. Protests erupted in London, Toronto, and New York. Both countries had vast diasporas abroad, each rallying behind their flag, their version of truth. In the Arabian Sea, Indian Navy destroyers moved into aggressive positions near the Sur Creek region. Pakistan responded by mobilizing its submarines. The strategic calculus was rapidly shifting. Both nations had tested the limits of their conventional military might in the past, but this time the rhetoric was nuclear. India warned of full-spectrum retaliation if any missile crossed into a civilian zone. Pakistan hinted at tactical nukes if Indian armor breached more than 20 kilometers past the lock. The world's worst nightmare crept closer with every hour. In Rawalpindi, ISI operatives went dark. Communications with field agents became irregular. Rumors spread of internal purges. The Pakistani military began moving mobile launcher units toward undisclosed locations in Gilgit-Baltistan. Meanwhile, China issued a carefully worded statement urging both parties to show wisdom, but satellite images showed increased PLA activity along the Lak in Ladakh. Russia remained quiet. The US sent carrier strike groups into the Indian Ocean as a deterrent. On the ground, the war became one of attrition. Gunfights erupted in the villages of Karna, Tangdar, and Tithwal. Civilians who had refused to evacuate now begged for passage through army corridors. NGOs attempted to deliver aid but were blocked due to active fire zones. Reports surfaced of militants using civilian homes as cover. India began deploying Israeli-made Heron drones to identify these locations and neutralize them with minimal collateral damage. It didn't always work. In some places, entire neighborhoods were flattened by a single misfire. In Amritsar, the city's hospitals operated in wartime mode. Blood banks ran low. Volunteers queued in the hundreds to donate. Military convoys passed through the city every few hours. In Lahore, the situation was similar. The city was tense, its skies thick with the smell of fuel and tension. Religious leaders on both sides called for calm, but radical groups began exploiting the chaos, pushing propaganda, inflaming hatred. A week into the conflict, over 4,000 lives had been lost. Half of them civilians. The UN called an emergency session. Turkey and Iran offered to mediate. Saudi Arabia remained neutral. Qatar began hosting indirect talks through backchannels involving retired generals from both nations. But on the ground, the fighting only intensified. The war between India and Pakistan, which had escalated so quickly and intensely, began to slow as both nations faced the overwhelming consequences of their actions. After several weeks of brutal fighting, the realization that neither side could claim a decisive victory settled in. The number of casualties mounted with each passing day, and entire communities were devastated. Cities and villages on both sides of the border had been reduced to rubble, their infrastructure shattered. The humanitarian crisis was unlike anything seen in the region for decades, with millions displaced and thousands of civilians dead. On the battlefield, both the Indian and Pakistani forces had suffered heavy losses. The military commanders on both sides began to recognize the futility of continuing the war with no clear end in sight. The leadership in New Delhi and Islamabad, initially bent on retaliation and retribution, found themselves cornered by the scale of destruction. The economies of both countries, already fragile before the conflict, were on the brink of collapse. Trade routes were blocked, industries were disrupted, and foreign investment had dried up. The international community, already alarmed by the use of military force in such a volatile region, began to put immense pressure on both countries to end the conflict. As the war reached its apex, a series of back-channel diplomatic negotiations were initiated. The United Nations, along with several key world powers, such as the United States, China, and Russia, played a pivotal role in pushing for a ceasefire. These negotiations were fraught with tension, as both sides were unwilling to make the first move toward de-escalation. But the toll of the war had become undeniable. The loss of life, the widespread destruction, and the near collapse of both nations' infrastructures left little room for further escalation. Amid this pressure, both India and Pakistan agreed to halt the fighting. The terms of the ceasefire were not easy to come by. Each country insisted on certain conditions to protect their sovereignty and their perceived security interests. India demanded that Pakistan take immediate steps to dismantle the militant groups operating within its borders, citing the initial attack in Pahalgam as evidence of Pakistan's complicity. Pakistan, on the other hand, sought guarantees of its territorial integrity and demanded that India halt its military presence in disputed areas. The ceasefire was fragile, but it held. Within days, the first humanitarian aid convoys began to reach the hardest-hit areas. Medical teams, food supplies, and clean water were brought in to treat the wounded and address the widespread suffering. The United Nations and various non-governmental organizations worked tirelessly to provide relief to those caught in the crossfire. Despite these efforts, the psychological scars of the war would take years to heal. Communities that had lived side by side for generations were torn apart by mistrust and hatred. Families were separated, and many had lost everything, from homes to loved ones. The international community worked quickly to broker a peace agreement between India and Pakistan. The United States and China, both key players in the region, helped facilitate discussions, urging both sides to focus on rebuilding and moving forward. A peace treaty was eventually signed, but the terms were contentious. While both countries agreed to return to the status quo along the line of control, the underlying issues that had caused the war, territorial disputes, cross-border militancy, and the broader question of Kashmir, remained unresolved. In the years that followed, India and Pakistan began the long process of rebuilding their nations. The immediate effects of the war on the economies of both countries were disastrous. Inflation soared, industries struggled to recover, and unemployment reached record levels. The global community pledged aid, but it was clear that both nations would need to make significant internal reforms to stabilize their economies. International aid was important, but it was not a permanent solution. Both countries had to reimagine their economic futures. Society, too, had been deeply affected. The war had left a generation of young people without opportunities, their futures uncertain. The psychological toll on civilians was immense. Survivors of the war, particularly those in the border regions, faced not only the trauma of having lived through the violence but also the fear of future conflicts. Nationalism had surged during the war, with citizens on both sides rallying behind their governments, but now that the fighting had stopped, many began to question the real cost of that nationalism. The war had shown the brutal reality of conflict, how it consumed lives, economies, and futures. Reconstruction efforts were complicated by this new reality. Both countries faced internal divisions, with different political factions attempting to leverage the situation to gain power. In India, Prime Minister Anya Verma's government was put under intense scrutiny for its handling of the war. Critics argued that the decision to escalate had been reckless, while others blamed the failure to achieve a decisive victory on military mismanagement. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Farooq Jalal faced similar challenges. His government had been forced to deal with the consequences of both the war and the internal unrest that followed. As the years passed, both countries made strides toward healing, but the scars of the war remained. There were efforts to rebuild relationships with their neighbors, and some initiatives were made to reduce tensions. However, the peace was fragile, as both countries continued to harbor deep mistrust. The lingering issue of Kashmir remained a thorn in the side of both nations, with no clear resolution in sight. The international community, while encouraging dialogue, knew that the peace achieved was only temporary and that the region's long-term stability would require a more comprehensive solution to the underlying issues. In the end, the war between India and Pakistan, which had seemed inevitable for so long, did not result in the total destruction that many had feared. However, the conflict had shown just how quickly things could spiral out of control when old wounds were reopened. The war, with its enormous toll on both countries, had proven that no one truly wins in such conflicts. The future of the region remained uncertain, with both India and Pakistan still trying to recover from the devastation. The lesson was clear: peace could never be taken for granted, and the path to lasting stability would require not just the cessation of hostilities but a true commitment to reconciliation, cooperation, and mutual understanding.